This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is April 16th, 2020, and this is episode 185.
I'm Scott Lundbaum.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, Andrew Wilkinson has some sharp criticisms for the Premier recently, so we're going to look at what's been happening politically in the province and federally as well. As we catch up, I guess I've been away for a couple weeks.
Yeah, welcome back.
Yeah, a bunch of personal issues came up, and that's how it goes. Thanks for filling in a couple really interesting interviews.
No problem. Glad you enjoyed them.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's thank those who continue to make this show possible, whether I'm here or not. We have 92 patrons every month. Thanks to our newest patrons, Sam and Carl. We're now at $284 a month. In particular, thanks to everyone else who's sticking with us through these tough times. We know things are still tough and money is tight, but, every dollar helps. And for the duration of the crisis, we've continued to keep our patron Slack open to all listeners. Go to legandbootmedia.ca if you want to request an invite to that. And as always, we're in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. And also go there because Shannon has put up a couple of her stories unpaywalled, so you can get a sense of the things she's writing about, including, for example, changes to BC's privacy laws during the pandemic that we'll talk about a little bit later. So lots of good content there. politicstoday.news. But let's jump into just a kind of flowing discussion. It's been roughly a month, I feel like, of real lockdown level changes. We're trying to figure out what day one of coronavirus COVID was in BC, and I guess the first press conference was in January, and cases have been happening for almost as long. But it was really...
It really seemed to get serious kind of around the 12th, 13th of March, towards the end of that week, whatever that was.
Yeah, right as spring break started for students here in BC. And in that time, there's been a number of measures. Things look like the curve is flattening, but I guess tomorrow morning, the BC government will release its latest models, and we'll see. Listeners will already probably seen that, whether it's good news or maybe it's less optimistic news, but either way, a lot has happened.
Yeah, so with the numbers, it's kind of been around 20 to 40 cases a day pretty consistently for a couple weeks, which seems to mean it's kind of not growing out of control, but we haven't clamped it down enough to where it's really washed out either. So I'm going to guess that tomorrow's announcement or models is going to show that we're kind of in that curve flattened area, but not ready to really loosen up yet, because if we keep getting 30 cases a day, as soon as we ease off, that can jump pretty quick.
Yeah.
Or pretty quick 2 weeks later when the test results actually come in from people who get symptomatic.
Yeah, and there's, I think, around 130 people in hospital at any given time, and that's declined a little bit, which is a very, very good sign, because, we haven't tested everyone, and so there's undoubtedly more cases out there. But it's time to start thinking about, I think, what we've done, what the next steps are. But even before we go to that, one of the things that hasn't come up much has been the leader of BC's official opposition, Andrew Wilkinson. I don't think I've heard from him in a month until like this last week, when he bubbled up for a couple BC Liberal virtual town halls, and then he did a big interview on This Is Van Colour, or at least it got a bunch of attention, a couple mentions, I think, in the province, and I managed to listen to it, and he had some sharp criticisms for John Horgan.
Yeah, specifically around why isn't John Horgan taking a more public-facing frontward role and kind of being a lot more visible, as well as some criticisms about not having a robust enough economic response.
Yeah, Andrew Wilkinson, everyone will remember, is a doctor and a lawyer. And from his past as a doctor, he says he's got a lot of faith in the, he kept calling it the biomedical approach we're taking. I think public health is the more accurate term, but he wanted, I don't, it was, there were some weird parts in there. It started right at the, like, within the first 3 minutes, he had already described how he couldn't imagine how tough this must be for someone living in a quote 1,000 square foot condo. And as you know, my my partner and my child live in a 750 square foot condo. I'm like, oh, if only we had 1,000 square feet.
Yeah, that line got a bunch of play on NDP Twitter, but that
It's
the
not the,
whole buzz around the whole buzz around that really seemed like well, a bunch of people who normally like to talk about politics were bored after a month of no real normal politics and looking for anything to latch on to.
it's not the most out of touch Andrew Wilkinson has been, to be fair.
It's not even really all that out of touch. I mean, there are 1,000 square feet condos out there.
So on the bigger question though of where is John Horgan, what is your take on that? Like right now, the majority of the response in BC is the daily briefings from Dr. Henry and almost always a health minister Adrian Dix with like a
I'm fine with it.
yeah.
Yeah, like it's. I mean, you want your public health people being the lead on the public health stuff, so you don't want the premier to be the one doing the daily case announcements, announcing or basically taking all of the stuff that Dr. Henry would normally be saying and just trying to be out there in front of the cameras and saying it instead. I think it gets to be a lot more reassuring to most people to hear it from the doctors directly. And with the other stuff, it's pretty much had the ministers responsible for whatever it is being the ones to do an announcement, which seems fine. I mean, the premier's there as the, head of government, the, most political person in a already political establishment. And having the ministers do those announcements kind of brings it a little more grounded into the nuts and bolts policy part of it.
Yeah, I largely agree. I've watched a few of Justin Trudeau's announcements, his daily briefings, and those because he's continuing to self isolate and try to lead by the work from home example are detached from the public health briefing. So they do, they're not overtly partisan, but they can be more political. He talks frequently about the benefits being given to Canadians, the payments, the plan that the federal government has, whereas at the British Columbia level, it's more, the focus is on bending the curve, the focus is on the public health response. I do wonder if the premier not being out there more regularly means people aren't aware of what the BC government has done and some of the measures it has rolled out, because you get your 1 day announcement and then you kind of hope people remember that, oh yeah, you also get $1,000 if you get the CERB the first time.
Well, I've been bombarded with advertising from the BC government on Facebook, so they definitely are pushing it out through other channels as well. And the premier is doing what, probably once a week or so. I don't know. Time is hard to wrap one's head around these days, but seems like roughly weekly he's doing a press conference of some sort.
Yeah. What was your take on the rest of the Wilkinson interview? I mean, a lot of his focus then became a criticism about the economic responses by the BC government.
I think that's largely fair. Like I think he was right when he says that the government's been a little slow to roll some stuff out because they've been waiting for the federal government. And I can see the why the province wants to do that in some ways, but it also does mean they haven't been as quick acting. And this really is kind of an all hands on deck situation. And it would be good if they were pushing stuff out quicker, even if there might mean some redundancies between the eventual federal and provincial programs. On the other hand, I think it was a little out of. I don't think it was right to point to the fact that they've had to go back and do a couple revisions to those policies because this really has been just a push stuff out as quickly as possible. And I think, as we talked about when with Kevin Milligan a couple weeks back, that inevitably means you need to tweak it as it goes out there and gets more feedback from the people who actually use the program.
Yeah, I thought the one thing was that was maybe a bit unfair was Wilkinson hammering on this. All he's done is this $5 million for mental health initiatives, which is not true. There has been significantly more rolled out than that. There was the renter's rebate, the $1,000
I
one-time
did talk about
payout.
the renter's rebate as well. I think this was recorded basically the day of or day after that announcement was, so it's just I think probably the freshest thing they were talking about.
But yeah, there's definitely more the BC government can and should do. It's been a little frustrating to see the BC government's response talk about, well, BC is the only one to roll out a renter's rebate, and the other provinces should step up on that. And it's like, well, it's nice, it's fine being better than the others, but that doesn't mean you're good enough. But I think that covers that interview. I want to move into some of the things it's actually rolling out here in BC. So today, the state of emergency was extended another 2 weeks until April 28th. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. As long as we need most people in a somewhat state of lockdown, then the province is going to keep extending the state of emergency. They have to do it in 2 week steps.
Yeah, like very clearly the emergency is not over. Like we've seemed to have stopped the fight from spiraling out of control, but it's very much still an ever-present challenge.
It is not time to unroll the mission accomplished banner on the aircraft carrier.
No.
Soon, hopefully, but probably not. Nevertheless, there's been some speculation in the media over the last week, some of it fueled, I think, by Education Minister Rob Fleming himself, who was starting to talk about what the return to classrooms for students will look like. And it wasn't clear if he was implying it would be before the end of the school year in June, but it might be. I did do a look around the world, and I'm not sure about South Korea, but at least Denmark is looking at opening schools for younger children already as they're seeing their cases drop, and they think that can be a way to support families with young children to ensure they can either get back to work or...
And I think Taiwan never closed their schools, but there's most places have kept them closed and don't really have any plans to reopen.
And then there's a comment in there that the schools will open if they can accommodate social distancing, which I guess means significantly reduce class sizes. I don't know quite how else you would do it, especially in an elementary school where grubby kids are running all over the place, touching and licking everything.
Yeah, I'm trying to bat through all my education in the BC school system. I don't think can think of a single case that would qualify as a socially distant classroom.
Among the other new initiatives from BC, particularly in the last week, just at the end of last week, BC rolled out this requirement for self-isolation plans on everyone arriving in BC from international flights, boats, or across the border. And this was something I could tell from the daily briefings that Adrian Dix in particular had been really frustrated, but that the federal government had moved to invoke the Quarantine Act, but then not really done anything on it. So BC essentially jumped ahead and said, well, if the feds aren't doing it, we're going to implement this ourselves. And I guess...
I'm not even sure if jump ahead is the right way to describe it, because this does seem to be coming pretty late after most international travels ground to a halt. And I get that this borders are the federal responsibility, but at the same time, this is over a month into fairly serious measures being enacted, and kind of got to wonder why it's taken this long.
Yeah, I don't think...
At either level.
Yeah, I don't think anyone saw it as an unreasonable move by BC given the full situation. It was a good question of, what... Because there was this question of, we've largely closed the borders, but a lot of Canadians are still returning home. The federal government said, okay, you have to self-isolate. But then there was no clear guidance from that. There were a lot of reports coming out of airports where people were like, well, I was handed a pamphlet and then just let go. And there was no follow-up. And so The
Yeah,
report
that seems to be what's missing here. Because I remember it was fairly early on, like middle of March, when they were talking about, okay, everybody does need to isolate who's coming back, but there was never any teeth put behind that.
And the really reassuring thing here is that the reports following Easter weekend were that there were, a few thousand people, a fraction of what would normally be landing in BC, who arrived and were given these orders. And of those, it seems like only a couple dozen, tens of people have, quote, required accommodations as they couldn't meet the necessary 14-day requirements, as in they didn't have somewhere to stay and the support's there. So I do appreciate that it sounds like the government is supporting people and not just handing them a ticket or something that would otherwise not assist the problem. So, and the fact that it's only a few people is actually pretty promising that maybe it was an overblown threat, but at least now we're ensuring that if people are coming back, they're going to stay isolated until they're clear. And then, of course, following this, the federal government finally rolled this type of system out for the rest of the country, as I guess they went, oh, I guess that's how you could do this.
I mean, better late than never, I guess. But I don't know. I keep circling back to it. It was like March when, what was it? The Alberta government and the city of Montreal had to send people to the airports to try and at least attempt a screening process. I'm just confused on why it took so long for any of this stuff to come into effect.
Well, and that keeps coming up for me in my mind, especially now. And as we look at some of the other measures the BC government is rolling out, for example, around the privacy changes for BC schools to be looking at using Zoom. BC did have a model and a plan in place for dealing with a pandemic, but it seems like a lot of holes were left in it and a lot of these policies that, there's going to be tweaking and inevitably challenges that you don't foresee. But the idea that if we shut down the economy and social distance as required, that a lot of people are going to be out of work and need money quickly should have been predictable. And these ideas around, people might need social isolation requirements, or if we end up closing the border, we'll need to make sure that those who do come through have clear guidelines to follow.
Yeah, I don't really want to use this phrase, but I'm having trouble thinking of an alternative. It's probably going to be a post-mortem on this whole thing to really dig into, the planning that went ahead of time and how the reactions came after. But it's probably one of those things where, yeah, the government has a pandemic plan and you try and involve all the appropriate departments and everything, but it's not necessarily going to be the case that you're going to be able to catch every little thing that comes out of it. And there's inevitably you're going to have to fill in a lot of the gaps as you go. And there was never going to be the possibility of a plan that you could just grab off the bookshelf and implement perfectly.
Was it the recent Dan Gardner piece in the Globe and Mail, I think, about how bad we are at looking at risks and to plan ahead for this? Governments need to do something that's very difficult for them, which is invest money in things that don't have a short-term gain. Like, this is a high risk, low short-term probability event. So it requires foresight and rational thought. But our politics, our political system that operates on 4-year or less election spans isn't incentivized to care about that. So
yeah, it was Dan Gardner. It's not just the political system. I mean, if there's, well, one of the many things this situation has shown is that people are pretty bad at probabilistic reasoning and reasoning with exponential functions as well. And like, I think both of us have pretty decent math backgrounds and we understand the concepts of risk and whatnot. But even so, it's hard to necessarily wrap our heads around the fact that, the expected outcome of something that is catastrophic and has a 1% chance is actually just has a very high expected cost to it and that it needs to be prepared. It's humans just aren't intuitive at that sort of thing. It takes a lot of work and education, frankly, to actually be able to consistently apply that sort of probabilistic thinking. And you even saw it with a bunch of governments in their initial responses. And, there's been a lot of second guessing of the experts and whatnot. And for the most part, that's kind of armchair quarterbacking. But there's were some people who, in January, I think it called this one rightly. And what I think was the main differentiating factor there is that they were more attuned to probabilistic thinking and tail risks. But that's really hard to institutionalize as well as just have that level of understanding and reasoning in a broad democratic system. It's a real challenge to decision making.
And so here we are, right in the middle of it. Coming back to some of the measures the government's been rolling out today, another new measure was around support for what they call businesses and local governments. There have been a growing number of stories around small businesses forced to close. The one that I think affects both of us most directly is the closure of Stormcrow Tavern permanently on Commercial Drive. Luckily, the one we hung out, or at least I used to hang out a lot more on, Broadway, is looking like it's staying open, but there are reports that something like a third of restaurants in BC will probably close permanently. And
I've seen numbers that depend on how long this lasts. It could be as few as 15% eventually reopen.
so more support is definitely needed. The announcements today include reducing most commercial property tax bills by 25%, cutting, for example, the school property tax rate, as well as some of the other, and as well as delaying some of the late penalties and just trying to free up additional cash flow. This is on top of earlier cuts and discounts to property taxes that the province has made. It's still going to be tough for businesses to make those lines work.
Yeah, so they're reducing some of the tax burdens on businesses, but even then, that kind of just softens the cost. It doesn't necessarily cover other costs that the businesses are going to be having to cover. And if their revenues dried up completely, it's not necessarily going to be enough to sustain them. And there's a federal government program to help, but even then, there's definitely businesses where it's going to be touch and go, especially after they've had to already do a bunch of layoffs and cuts.
And the other challenge that has been coming out is cities. And eventually I'll get around to talking about this or get someone to talk about this on Cambie Report. But Vancouver, for example, Mayor Kennedy Stewart last weekend bizarrely tried to claim the city was going to go bankrupt, as though Vancouver would stop existing, which clearly was a little bit exaggerating. Nevertheless, the municipalities across the province and across the country are facing a huge challenge, as their budgets are often much more fixed than provinces, where they tend to have very limited opportunities to borrow. So the provincial government here is allowing local governments to borrow interest-free from existing capital reserves to help pay for operating expenses, and also allowing them to carry debt for an additional year. Essentially, they're not giving them any money yet, but they're saying at least you can have access to some capital that'll let you pay your staff so you don't have to, as Burnaby just did, lay off 1,500 union employees and not a single manager.
I find this announcement today kind of underwhelming. Being able to draw off of capital reserves, yeah, it does stop the immediate bleeding and prevents governments from having to lay people off right away, but it has its own drawbacks for sure. And most notably, the fact that that capital money needs to be used to actually build out the various capital works that cities require. And this could end up shortchanging that, and that could also have further knock-on effects, because if cities aren't putting out capital works, that's going to impact the construction sector, and then you've just kind of changed where the job losses happen. And hopefully the recovery package, once the social distancing requirements start to be drawn down and we are trying to restart the economy, hopefully that has a big chunk of infrastructure spending on it, but that's not guaranteed. And there's stuff that the cities need to be doing now, and this could potentially harm that in the long term. And I think it would be much better if the province either just allowed cities to borrow money in times of hardship and not have to rely on capital reserves for that, or just use the province's own power to borrow money at cheaper rates than cities to just cover off the gap in it. And it also really doesn't cover the problems that are affecting TransLink, where they're I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they're taking pretty significant losses as well on their stuff, and they're going to have to scale down a lot of their services and potentially slow down their long-term expansion plans as well, which has the problem, which isn't really addressed here. There's a single line in the press release about this will allow governments to continue to meet their funding requirements for TransLink, but that hasn't been the big problem right now. The big problem with TransLink is it doesn't have the passengers who are paying the fares to cover off its own spending needs.
Well, it also doesn't have the revenue from the gas tax because no one is driving anywhere. Basically, it's got a revenue problem, and so that needs to be sorted out. And TransLink is obviously something that we need to survive, and it's, a continent-leading transit system. And so I hope more is being discussed between the province and federal government, and maybe they're trying to come to a deal to split the costs so that it doesn't hit one set of books, the hardest. But there's a lot of money that needs to be freed up still for all of these different agencies. Other things that have happened, over the long weekend, a lot of people were really concerned about people taking the ferries and going all over the province and going camping and taking trips. And there were all the next round of social media posts trying to shame people for riding the ferries. But BC Ferries came out after and said this long weekend saw a 92% decrease in traffic between Vancouver and Nanaimo or Victoria over last year, which is a staggering drop. And other routes have seen an 80% decline. So there are fewer ferries running at half capacity. So undoubtedly they feel fuller than they might otherwise be, but they're actually quite empty.
And Transport Canada's changed the rules to allow people to stay in their cars during the sailing for the duration of the crisis, so people aren't mingling about on the upper decks. And a decent chunk of that few percentage that is still traveling, that's going to be trucking, that's going to be essential workers having to move between different cities and to fulfill their jobs. So it's going to be the case that there's going to be some traffic, and that's fine. The ferries just need to be able to handle that as safely as possible.
And it seems like they are. So positive steps there. I also put in here about the $5 million going to mental health supports, which is positive. There was also an announcement, I believe it was today or yesterday, about supports for post-secondary students with mental health issues, helping them cope, because I think we both know a bunch of professors and lecturers at UBC and SFU who are taking on a sort of dual role right now as continuing online classes, but then also coping with a lot of students sending questions about just like, how do we, personally manage this situation? And professors aren't generally trained in psychology or therapy or helping in that kind of situation. And so this seems like a pretty important move that I suspect has been in a work for a while and thankfully is being rolled out.
Yeah, seems like a good program to announce. There'll probably no doubt be more stuff coming in the future on that. Well, let's dig into some of the policies that have gotten little changes since they were initially rolled out. As we mentioned earlier, that's kind of inevitable when you're stringing together a whole bunch of new programs in a matter of days. But a couple of these are the BC has taken over the staffing of care homes, and the current estimates are costing about $10 million a month to handle the staffing requirements. And this is put in place so that care workers who before would often work in multiple locations aren't traveling between care homes and potentially spreading COVID.
Yeah, that's an extra $10 million a month over what we'd otherwise be spending on long-term care staffing costs across the province. So this was kind of the biggest possible story, like care homes in general across Canada, as every province, it seems, is kind of dealing with this same situation where outbreaks that are happening where they're the worst in this country are largely happening in these retirement long-term care homes, whether they're public, private, nonprofit. You get some staff bring something in, or a guest or a resident has it, and it spreads quickly, it spreads fast, and because seniors do tend to be in the highest risk demographic, you get a lot of deaths. There have been care homes where 10, 20, 30. I think there was one care home out east where 30% of residents have died. It's not clear if how, what portion of that was directly from COVID, but it's a significant issue. And so what BC has done, I think, has been somewhat underreported, because as I listened to a couple of the talks by Dr. Henry and Adrian Dix a few weeks ago about what moves they were making and why it took so long, and it's not fully even done yet. BC, for what Dr. Henry referred to as over 20 years, or for the last 20 years, has been moving to, quote, more contracts and subcontracts in these long-term care facilities where, you outsource the cleaning staff, or you outsource this contract and they outsource it to someone else. And over time, it's gotten very complicated, and you'll have workers who are working at one facility most of the time, but they're not getting a great wage, and they could get a few more hours at this care home across the city at a slightly higher wage. So they take that on part-time, and they're going back and forth to make ends meet. And, that's not a great situation in the best of times, but once you have a pandemic where a highly infectious virus can then be transported from one care home to another, it becomes very deadly. And I think that's what we've seen in BC. So this move to ensure that each worker has one home that they work in is very prudent. And $10 million a month for this might seem like a bit much, because this is one small sector of the healthcare system. It is a matter of saving the most vulnerable to this disease. And so the challenge for the province has been, how did they do that? And what they had to basically do was take over every single one of those contracts just by order of the public health official, by fiat, make them all now government employees. Because they're able to do that, they can give them all the same wage no matter where they work at, and then start assigning them. And now they've slowly started working through that and have been assigning people. And it sounds like most of the province has this in place now, but it's still finalizing itself in some of the busier areas like the Lower Mainland.
Yeah, it's a pretty messy web to untangle.
Yeah, it's an insight into how complex government is in some of these situations, and how slowly it can take to overturn this. And this is kind of a web that had built up over decades of policy choices, and they've put this in place for the next 6 months. But pre-COVID-19, pre-coronavirus, I know the NDP had been looking at the situation in long-term care homes and been considering how to ensure more equitable work and situations for the employees, and also quality of care for the residents. And I'm sure this won't be the last change. And they may not be able to keep this permanent, but I don't think we're going back to the same situation as before.
Yeah, I expect we'll see some significant reforms post COVID.
So definitely it's the thing to keep an eye on. The other thing I think we need to keep watching is how this province is going to support renters, because it wasn't officially a rewrite of the policy as much as when the details came out, everyone kind of went, that doesn't sound like exactly what you said it was.
Well, part of that was they didn't have everything sorted out ahead of time. The famous bit about not knowing whether or not this would apply to a single household, or if there were multiple renters, as roommates, they could each apply for it. So there was still a lot to work out when they first announced it.
Yeah, the initial policy sounded like $500 for every renter to be paid to their landlord to help them cover it if they've lost work due to COVID-19. Now it's $300 to individuals and $500 to couples and families. You must either be on EI or get the CERB, or otherwise show that you've lost at least a quarter of your monthly income. And then I believe you need your landlord to apply. And there's also cutoffs based on last year's tax returns.
Doesn't seem particularly a great way to do it. There's, I think, a generally pretty decent argument for means test in a lot of things, but in this particular case where there has been such a big change in so many people's economic fortunes just over a month, it's really just not the case that a 2019 tax return will tell you really anything about a person's 2020 income or ability to pay for things.
Yeah, and there's some weird elements to that. It seems like it's too late for it to be tweaked too much more, but guess every policy seems to be tweaked every day at this point. So BC government has been moving quick to change too many of these things. I still think it is overall a pretty positive move. I mean, getting money to help people keep their homes is important. Like the eviction ban is in place, so people, for the most part, won't be kicked out, but they are still on the hook for that rent. So making sure you can get some money flowing to help make sure the landlords are also solvent, because we don't want people going bankrupt because of this.
Yeah, and if the landlords can't pay their bills, then that can create its own credit crunch in the financial system, and you know we don't want to have to untangle a jammed up real estate credit market as well when we get to the other side of this. So yeah, good. Overall, I think a decent policy that kind of tries to make as many people, if not whole, at least covered off and keep some cash flow going.
Well, let's pivot and discuss some of the other random stories that have been catching our eyes over the last couple of weeks. The first one that, because I follow so much Alberta politics, because of where I grew up, that's really been in my eye is this weird move by Alberta to donate like 1 million pieces of personal protective equipment to Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. Specifically, BC got 250,000 N95 masks. And we also got a bunch of ventilators and other equipments. And that's great for us, but it left a lot of people in Alberta going, don't we also need it? Which was unclear. And then Alberta apparently spent $14,000 to $20,000 on Facebook ads promoting this donation to people across the country, kind of just pumping up the, hey, aren't we so generous here in Alberta?
Yeah, it's a weird thing to do. I was taking a look at the case numbers just before we recorded, and yeah, Alberta actually has more cases than we do right now, which makes the decision to donate mass seems a little short-sighted. I don't know how big their stockpile was before this, but it's not clear that they also don't need the masks, and this really seems like a weird kind of let's get some good press for Alberta thing rather than a real coordinated way of going about ensuring that PPE is distributed across Canada to where it's needed most.
Yeah, I've read a lot of people try to analyze this as maybe Alberta's just trying to buy political capital in the other provinces so that when things are more back to normal, those pipelines will get moving more easily, even though we're in a situation where oil is, I think Alberta oil hit a low of $1 or $2 a barrel this week and maybe came back up to 5 or 10.
Wow, so the beer I'm drinking costs more than a barrel of oil.
Yeah. The game of, look around your room and point at all the things that are worth more than Alberta oil is endlessly fun when you're trapped in a room.
Yeah, I actually the other day saw a gas station with a price that started with an 8, which is something I never thought I would see.
Not in a long time. I guess gas is like 50 cents or less in Alberta right now. And the argument always is if Alberta can get its oil to Tidewater to the coast, then they can close the gap with West Texas and some of the higher priced oil. But even then, they're only looking at $10 or $20 a barrel, which is still significantly less than it takes to make the oil sands extraction profitable. And maybe demand will come back up and prices will come slightly back to normal after this crisis.
Yeah, so West Texas, I've just looked it up now. West Texas is trading at $19.71 right now. So it's actually a decent spread, but even that's not enough to keep the oil sands running.
And there's consideration that the world is trying to move, or a lot of the world is trying to move to more renewable energies, and at some point get off oil, and using this as somewhat of an opportunity to reimagine our economy, less dependent on burning stuff from the ground, seems positive. So Alberta's fascination with the oil economy is weird. But one area where the premiers are getting along is they all agree, as usual, that the federal government shouldn't get in their way. There was a letter from the prime minister to each of the premiers late last week, sort of broaching whether the Emergencies Act should be invoked as a way to ensure a coordinated national response. This would allow the federal government to prohibit travel, render essential services, regulate supplies of goods, seize personal property, and take over supply lines, really tread into provincial jurisdiction a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the province never liked people, or they never liked the federal government telling them what to do. But it's also, yeah, I do think it's the case that we're not at the point where there does need to be a federal government stepping in and to handle more of the coordination issues around PPE and other essential items. More or less keeping things under control. Alberta and Quebec are experiencing a lot more difficulties right now, and they potentially are at a point where it could get pretty bad. But it's not necessarily clear that the federal government needs to be the ones to step in right now. Best to keep that as an option, but not roll it out prematurely.
Yeah, each province has its own powers, and like you say, most of them are doing pretty well. So the federal government jumping into this is just going to annoy a lot of people. And to do that, they would have had to recall Parliament as well, which raises one of the things that's been on my mind back and forth about whether Parliament should try to meet virtually. And I've generally been more of the view that that is significantly harder than most people want to admit, generally because I think too much about rules of order and things like that, and individual MPs' right to object. And anyone who's been on too many Zoom calls or whatever in the last few weeks knows that every once in a while someone's video cuts out or audio cuts out and they freeze. And if you're an MP in an important debate, that can't happen.
Well, or you could get what happened here in Vancouver, where a still unidentified counselor didn't have their phone on mute when they went to flush the toilet.
The
And that got broadcast across the council video live stream.
Yeah, the muting, unmuting of microphones is forever important. Nevertheless, though, over in the UK, where their parliament is significantly bigger, I think they have 650 MPs, they have agreed between the government and opposition to have a virtual sitting where it's going to be a kind of hybrid model. There'll be 50 MPs in the House of Commons distancing themselves apart, and then another 120 will connect using Zoom, actually, the one tool that the federal government of Canada has told all agencies to not use because of security holes. And they'll do kind of a virtual question period or prime minister's questions and ask questions of the key ministers. Now, Boris Johnson won't be there because he's still recovering from having coronavirus and going to ICU, but key ministers will be there, and it will give the opposition some chance to hold them accountable, which honestly I think is a good step. It would be, because right now the most we have is journalists trying to ask some things on Trudeau's daily press briefing in the morning.
And that's really not equivalent to a full question period where the opposition is asking probing questions in a way the press doesn't, in a way that's different than how the press does things.
Yeah, and the UK Parliament will still require any votes to be held in person, which makes sense because they haven't figured out exactly how they could do it securely remotely. The one difficulty there is the way the UK Parliament votes is MPs have to leave the chamber and then enter on the yes or no side. And so they actually get they get crammed into a smaller space. So it's the exact opposite of what they should be doing. So I think they'll have a very small meeting to approve these changes with the minimal number of MPs, and they'll just very slowly and spaced apart go through the voting chamber room. Luckily, our parliament doesn't require that, to my knowledge.
No, I don't think it does.
These are changes that, the BC legislature could also be looking at least having a question period type system in place, and then going from there to think about what else we could do.
Yeah, because this could quite conceivably last a year or longer, where some degree of social distancing is going to be required continuously through that, and you can't have a parliamentary democracy not have parliament meet for that long a period of time.
Belgium strongly disagrees with you. Wasn't it them who went
They didn't even have a government.
for like 4 years,
I,
right? No, it wasn't.
I thought it was like 580 some odd days.
Okay, just a year and a bit.
That might have just been the first time they've done that a couple times. But I'd like to at least exceed the Belgian standard here.
Yeah, and both the provincial and federal governments have a number of initiatives not related to coronavirus that they were hoping to roll out here in BC, the ICBC reforms, as well as a number
Well,
of the other
good.
changes they
Well,
were
good news
looking
for
at.
ICBC is with so few people driving, their insurance payouts have probably dropped quite a bit.
And the courts are closed, so they're not spending any money on that. And the federal government is also up against the court deadlines to make changes to the assisted dying laws, which I'm sure they might be able to get another extension, but at some point they will need to roll through some bill on that, or there's going to be
Yeah,
some weird.
I'm gonna guess courts are going to be fairly flexible with the can we have an extension because of giant global crisis.
The first or second time, but eventually they we need to start changing our society. So things to keep thinking about. Similarly, elections, we need to think about those. Elections Canada is reportedly looking at how to run an election during a pandemic. It's not within the power of the Elections Act, it turns out, to hold a full postal ballot across Canada. They could expand it greatly, but without a new amendment, we do have to go vote in person, and they don't want to happen what happened in some US primaries in the last couple months where an outbreak was happening and they were like, well, let's go ahead with in-person voting.
Yeah, like the whole Wisconsin thing was an utter disaster, and we want to avoid that.
And I don't know anything
I mean,
that BC is doing on that, though apparently some states in the US, like Hawaii and even Oregon and Washington, do hold their elections almost entirely through mail-in ballots.
yeah, well, the U.S. has its own giant problem where the very question of whether or not people should have to vote in person or you can mail in a ballot has become a whole partisan political fight. Thankfully, that doesn't seem to be the case here in Canada. Um, but yeah, we will definitely need to have some sort of legislative change to the uh, definitely the federal elections act and probably the BC one too to set up a full postal voting system.
Just as long as they don't do it online.
Yes, that would definitely be the thing we wouldn't want at all to happen. We thankfully have a little over a year and a half to figure this out here in BC. It's a minority parliament federally. Well, I guess technically minority parliament here too, but a stable one. Federally, I think it's unlikely any party's going to force an election at this time.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is an inherently unstable situation, and you do want to have Elections Canada ready to go if they do need to run an election. So hopefully that gets sorted out soonish.
Yeah. Remember a couple months ago when Peter MacKay and Aaron O'Toole and the rest of the Conservative candidates were all chomping at calling an election as soon as they became leader? I don't know where their position is now, but at least Andrew Scheer is saying we're not keen to bring the government down right now.
I imagine leveler heads have prevailed. They're not super keen either.
Nevertheless, within the Conservative Party, they have been talking about a few other things.
Now, the one place that will actually probably have to figure this out sooner rather than later is Saskatchewan, which is the province with the next provincial election scheduled. They their elections set for November 2nd, so in theory, it's possible that it could be the pandemic could be in a much better place. A lot of the experts are concerned about a second wave in the fall, so it's quite likely that Saskatchewan could be in a similar state in November as they are now. So they, in particular, really need to get on this.
Despite not wanting to bring down the government, the Conservatives, at least federally, are also looking at, I guess, challenging the WHO of all things. They're not going as bombastic as Trump, who has cut off US funding to the WHO, but they're justifiably frustrated that Canada's essentially representative to the WHO, Bruce Alward, failed to show up at the parliamentary committee on COVID-19. But then she added some comments about the WHO's reliance on data from China and the influence, quote, that China has on the World Health Organization.
So I don't think it's entirely off base here. He definitely was about reliance on data from China because, well, that was where the only data was for the first 2 months or month and a half, 2 months. Um, that's kind of unavoidable. But at the same time, there were also clearly missteps, and there was some information that got put out by the WHO. I think mid January, there was a statement to the effect that there's no evidence of person to person transmission of the virus, which was pretty clearly wrong, definitely in retrospect. And that was probably relying a bit too heavily on what was being relayed from the government of China, which was trying to minimize the situation for their own political reasons. I think mostly domestic political reasons. So, like, there's some concern there, and there's been concerns that Taiwan isn't necessarily getting the attention it deserves for its effective suppression of the virus, and that for political reasons, the WHO has been reluctant to engage with that. But like at the same time, the conservatives have clearly gone a bit overboard on this one, and Trump in particular. Well, with like so many things he done, hasn't thought through the next thing that will happen after an impulsive decision. Because after the U.S., which I think puts about $500 million a year into the WHO, China's the next big spender, one of the next major players. And if you have China become the main person funding the WHO, it would only make any influence worse.
Well, and the other half of this is, back in Alberta, Jason Kenney is talking a similar line. He had a bunch of criticisms for Dr. Theresa Tam, the federal public health official, and he was complaining similarly about her not closing the borders as early, and, quote, was repeating talking points out of the People's Republic of China about no evidence of human-to-human transmission, which gets into like some weird realm. Like I don't think this is directly, a racial gender thing, but that issue is out there. And I think the issue here is when you have a politician going after the scientist rather than Trudeau. Like if Kenney leveled this against Trudeau, it wouldn't be as and that's not to say the public health officials are above criticism, but
yeah, Jason Kenney would criticize any federal government for being too friendly with the People's Republic of China. So in that sense, this may be overdetermined.
And this comes as Jason Kenney talked about Alberta kind of not waiting for Health Canada to catch up to, for example, the European Medicines Agency or the FDA on trialing certain tests or other treatments for COVID-19, which is a weird kind of federalism flex to say Alberta doesn't need to go through the same processes as every other province. Like Health Canada exists to centralize these strengths.
It's actually something I don't know, but I'm now super curious about is but healthcare is ultimately a responsibility of the province, but we do a bunch of the medical regulations at the federal level. There's pretty good efficiency reasons for that, but in terms of our federalism structure, is there anything that could just stop a province from going ahead with their own set of regulations?
Yeah, it's a complicated realm. I mean, I'm sure Kenny could do it. He might risk health transfers for it. It's just a weird tug of war.
I don't know. We clearly need to get someone on here who knows the ins and outs of the Canada Health Act and the interplay of federal and provincial jurisdictions on this. Even so, like no federal government's done cut health transfers in the middle of a pandemic.
Indeed. So the only other story I had my eyes on, and this is kind of an evolving one that might just go away because I would be surprised if they can get unanimous consent for it. But amid the number of conspiracy theorists that are out there, Privacy Council President Dominic LeBlanc has started musing openly about some kind of federal law to fight misinformation, and whether that's putting additional powers in the RCMP to police social media posts or arrests people like the guy who was wandering around Vancouver trying to start a end the lockdown protest. Worryingly, this got support from NDP MP Charlie Angus. Scheer expressed what I thought were some pretty reasonable criticisms that this could be a significant overreach into quelling freedom of expression. Like, I think there is a challenge here with disinformation and bad actors and people who, put the public health at risk by spreading this kind of BS. But it's a very difficult thing for the government to actually regulate.
Yeah, there's a very real problem with the misinformation that's been out there around COVID-19. But at the same time, this is the sort of thing that would be really easy to abuse. And I don't think any liberals would have been too happy if Stephen Harper had brought in a law like this, because they would have immediately seen all the ways it could potentially get abused.
And it's not even really clear how you could craft the law to capture this. If you're just going after, people holding these kind of protests in public, well, that's already captured under municipal and provincial public health orders against public gatherings. If it's about online speech, are you starting to go after Facebook and Twitter? And even if you do, these things just proliferate and it's a whack-a-mole situation. Like, ultimately, I think this does have to come down to trying to put reliable information out there, having voices like Dr. Tam, Dr. Bonnie Henry, putting good information, being more transparent. I think releasing these models in the last couple of weeks has been a good step. And the more transparent the governments can be about the decisions they're making, the more positive this can be and the more social buy-in we can get, which is still pretty high. That's, I think, the strategy we have to keep taking, because it seems to be working for the most part right now.
Yeah, overall, the uptake has been, I think, pretty good on a lot of their recommended measures. Social media is full of the examples that aren't, but the thing about social media is it tends to elevate a whole lot of unrepresentative things that stir outrage. So I wouldn't take too much from it, and by and large, things are going pretty well, and at least here in BC, and this might just be too coarse a tool to what they need to do to kind of get that last little bit to comply and stop spreading misinformation.
Well, I think that pretty much brings me up to speed with everything I've wanted to talk about for the past 2 weeks. I know we're still looking for more guests, so we can do a number of different topics. We have a guest lined up to talk about how the environment is changing because of this for next week's show. Listeners, if you have ideas for guests, please send them to us. Get at us on Twitter or email us podcast@politicos.ca. We want to know what you think.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to everything we talked about at politicos.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/politicos. Intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Saoirse Plattenkoff. Playtrust is a production of Leg and Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.